It's an old truism that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and I think it's accurate to say that about this particular counteroffensive. What's happened is that the depth of the Russian minefields is considerably deeper, more concentrated, more difficult to get through than was anticipated. The Ukrainians just don't have the kind of breaching capabilities that, say, we would bring to bear. No air power, limited armored breaching systems, line charges that will go 100 meters, but the minefields are many, many times that depth. And so they've had to adjust. And I think the real question we should constantly be asking is, have they adapted in a way that seems to be correct? And is that adaptation achieving results? And the answers to both of those, I believe, are yes. What they have done is, instead of the kind of combined arms breaching that perhaps we would have sought to do, but with enormous air power and all kinds of other capabilities that, again, Ukraine doesn't have, instead of that, you essentially have 10-man teams, essentially squads that are painstakingly fighting from tree line to tree line, house to house, picking their way literally through these minefields, creating breaches. But it's very, very difficult because the Russians not only have a very complex and layered defense in depth with tank ditches, these minefields, anti-tank, anti-personnel, again, of enormous depth. They're much deeper, actually, than Russian doctrine calls for, which is, I think, one of the revelations, again, as they have gotten into this. Trench lines with Russian soldiers, dragon's teeth, other obstacles to armored weapon systems. But then also, on top of all of this, are Russian drones and Russian eyeballs as well, of course, with observers that are bringing to bear the substantial artillery and rocket fire that Russia can employ. And that's what makes it really hard to get through these minefields and through these obstacles and through the other fortifications. And the Ukrainians have been achieving progress. They've done so in this area around Robotyne, which is in the center south of Zaporizhia Oblast or province. There's progress on the border area between Zaporizhia and Donetsk, which is a bit to the east. And then further east and a bit north from that, there's been progress around that city of Bakhmut, which was the sole achievement, of course, of the Russian winter offensive. They took that city, basically destroyed it in so doing. And the Ukrainians have essentially taken back the flanks of that and are beginning to threaten the viability of the Russian forces in that city as well. What's most important, though, is the first one that I mentioned, because in the area of Robotyne, the Ukrainian forces have broken through the first line of defenses. And that's very significant because these are the most substantial. Now, there are second and third lines and so forth. They're not going to be easy at all. But that first line breakthrough is significant, and the Ukrainians are now widening that breach. They're expanding it on either side. They're solidifying the security of the flanks of this penetration and then pushing farther. And of course, the objective is to get close enough to the line of communications that the Russians used for resupply and logistics and so forth from Russia proper along the southeast coast and southern coast of Ukraine, and then ties down into the Crimean Peninsula. But if you can get close enough to that you can interdict it, you can make it untrafficable, essentially, with artillery and rockets that the Ukrainians have, that would be a very significant achievement. Ideally, you'd like to physically cut it, but if you can get just within range of it, you can make that very challenging for the Russians to use. Beyond that, of course, they'd like to further damage, ideally destroy the bridges and roads that connect the Crimean Peninsula into southern Ukraine. And of course, even more ideally would be to take down the Kerch Strait Bridge that runs from Russia to the southeastern part of the Crimean Peninsula. Again, all of this is to try to make that logistical support of Russian forces ever more difficult, to isolate them in a way similar to what was done on a much smaller scale, as you'll recall, for the Russian forces that were to the west of the Dnipro River in Kherson, in the center-south part of Ukraine. But again, there is progress. It has been slow. It's been very hard fought. It has been costly. But the Ukrainians have adapted, and I think they've done it quite impressively. And the question now is, can they continue to make this progress? And do the Russian forces at some point begin to crack, perhaps to crumble? That's something to watch for very carefully, because that would be an indicator that now you can get the defense moving. You can make it dynamic, and then perhaps the Ukrainians could bring their newly acquired Western combined arms capabilities, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and so forth, to bear in a more aggressive manner, frankly, than has been possible because of, again, the complexity of this defense in depth that the Russians have established. The Russians have not distinguished themselves particularly, of course, during the course of this war. They lost the battles of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv Oblast, again, Kherson west of the Dnipro, but they have put in a very formidable defense in depth, especially in the south. And this is, you may hate your enemy, and we do, they do, but I think you have to respect the competence, in this case, of the Russian forces in establishing such a substantial defense. And of course, to be sure, the Russian general who oversaw that, Surovikin, is no longer in uniform, we don't believe. He fell on the wrong side of Putin during the Prigozhin episode. But this is a very, very serious challenge that the Ukrainians have been confronting. And again, they've adapted. They have made progress, and we need to watch that continued progress now, keeping in mind that there could be perhaps as much as 4 months of fighting before the winter rains slow it down. The Ukrainians are going to continue to fight throughout the winter without question. But when the ground gets soft, when it gets soggy, when it gets really muddy, it's just very difficult to go cross country with armored systems. And so that would be the limiting factor at that point.
There's been a lot of second guessing. There's a lot of speculation in media about what could happen. There's an election coming up, a lot of nervousness, I think, both on the U.S. side and on the Ukrainian side. I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Well, I think you mentioned the Washington Post op-ed. It was basically sort of stop second guessing, the Ukrainians know far better than we do their own terrain, their own country, the strengths of their forces, and frankly also the limitations of their forces. And they have crafted a strategy that I think is working. I think it's the right strategy, which is to keep the Russians stretched out all along a 600-mile front. That's a very substantial distance if you think about it. I mean, it's 300. The fight to Baghdad was just 350 miles. We thought that was a very considerable distance. This is 150 miles farther. And then they are painstakingly working their way through this defense. And while they're doing that, they're setting the conditions for further success by attriting the Russian ammo supply points, their fuel depots, again, their logistical lines of communication, their headquarters, their reserve force locations, the artillery, trying to reduce that as well. Again, in addition to the frontline fighting on which everyone is focused, but this attrition effort that they have ongoing to try to degrade the Russians' ability to support their forces, I think is very important, because if they can do that sufficiently, again, then these forces might start to crumble, might start to collapse if those forces realize that the higher-ups don't seem to care enough for them to feed them on a regular basis or keep them fueled or what have you. So, and then at a certain point in time, I think if they can achieve the kind of breakthrough that it would like to see, they can then bring to bear, they can really strike and take advantage of that. But again, lots of tough fighting, very difficult defenses to get through. And again, we got to stop second guessing. I was the recipient of the 8,000-mile screwdriver from Washington in a number of different commands and combat. And we need to do a lot less of that and a lot more when it comes to just absolutely continuing to provide everything that we possibly can to enable them to succeed, not just in the short term here over the next few months until the winter rains and snow arrive, but also in the longer term, because we need to be preparing them for the future offensives that are going to be necessary in this war to accelerate the delivery of the F-16s, the training of the pilots and the crews, to provide cluster munitions for rockets, not just for artillery. And by the way, the artillery cluster munitions, all the feedback is that they have been very, very helpful to the Ukrainians. And that's just what you need, again, when you're going against this kind of defense. You need an area weapon system on a lot of these targets, not just a unitary warhead. So, again, that's what we should be doing, and a little bit less, I think, of sort of publicly, anonymously questioning whether they're going about this the right way, because I also think that they are going about it the right way.
If you like our today's video, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel and comment subscribed. I'll make sure to leave a reply to each one of my viewers. Thanks for watching this video.